If you follow the geopolitical change and especially follow the geoeconomic change, you must be familiar with the name called Thomas Sowell. Now, recently, Thomas Sowell, in one interview, that he heavily criticized what Donald Trump did regarding placing more tariffs upon nations worldwide. And his message was very clear and simple. Stop the trade war, allowing more nations like China, Japan to work collaboratively with the US. But meanwhile, according to Marco Rubio, the current Secretary of the State, now what he stated also during one interview was quite stunning. This is what he said. Markets are crashing because markets are based on the stock value of companies who today are embedded in modes of production that are bad for the United States of America, end quote. How do we understand that? I mean, again, it's not a surprise that Donald Trump is a believer of tariffs, and given the fact that lately he's been placing more tariffs upon nations, and such as China, South Korea, Vietnam. Of course, it sends shock waves across the world. What does that say about the relationship between US and China at this moment? And how do we know that China is going to fight back in order to make the noises even louder? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Mr. Bob Davis. Mr. Davis has covered most every big economic stories of the past 40 years, including the rise of China, the challenge from Japan, and the global financial crisis. And he's the author of the book, Superpower Showdown, How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatened a New Cold War. Well, Mr. Davis, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, Mr. Davis, I want to get started with a very simple question. How do we understand the latest move under Donald Trump regarding place more tariffs upon the nations, and for example, like China, like Vietnam? I mean, again, over your career, you covered extensively regarding the Chinese economic growth or also this Chinese economic turmoil. So at this moment, how do we understand the move under Donald Trump, and how do you think that China is going to react to Donald Trump's behavior? Your thoughts?
Well, I think to start, you can't overestimate how much Trump thinks that he understands tariffs and that tariffs are the weapon, the technique to change the way the U.S. does business and to give him leverage over other countries. He has believed this since the 1980s. Again, think about Donald Trump. He is not a policy-driven person, remotely. But back then, back in the 1980s, he was a real estate developer in New York, basically, seen as a playboy who squirreled around, beautiful models and was on the page 6, which is kind of the gossip page of the New York Post. And he wanted to have a more serious image. And the way in which he tried to do that was through international economics. At that time, Japan was the issue for the United States. He came out for heavy tariffs on Japan. But at that time, a lot of CEOs, a lot of famous CEOs took very similar positions. Lee Iacocca, who is the head of Chrysler, took a position like that. The head of Motorola, the head of Intel took positions like that. So it wasn't that unusual. And over time, all those other CEOs were replaced by internationally minded chief executive officers. And only Donald Trump was the only big CEO left who believed that. So it is core of cores. In the first Trump administration, he used tariffs enormously against China, no doubt, absolutely. China was the focus. This time, it is not only China, and I don't think China is his primary focus. It is the rest of the world. He thinks, and this is truly the way he thinks about it, he thinks every country that has a persistently large trade surplus with the United States is taking advantage of the United States, and the way to get back at it is through tariffs. So he uses tariffs. And he doesn't have the more senior officials that he had last time who might restrain his action, target it better. So you got pure Trump is what you have at the moment.
Well, Mr. Davis, again, when we look at the list of the countries, in addition to China, Vietnam, and Japan, we're also looking at Cambodia, Malaysia, Australia, Turkey. I mean, the list went on and on and on. But during one interview, not
Every
direct.
country except Russia.
There you go. Every country except for Russia. Now, during one interview, not directly to Donald Trump, but to the current Vice President J.D. Vance, and this is what he said, and I quote, Trump administration strategy is to rearrange trade and tariff policy to bring jobs back to the U.S., end quote. Now, this is really a hot topic just based on, the reaction within the international community. So from your experience and also your coverage, how credible is the sentence? So in other words, it's not just about J.D. Vance. It's not just about Donald Trump. It's really about bringing the jobs back to the U.S. So that's why under the Trump administration or under Donald Trump, that placing more tariffs, it's rather beneficial or advantageous to the American citizens. Your thoughts?
Well, I think Vance accurately reflects the way Trump thinks about it. I mean, it is true. You can use tariffs to reorient manufacturing back to the home country. There have been lots of countries that have done that. I mean, it doesn't, if you go back to the 19th century, that's the way countries raised revenue to start with. But in, say, the post-World War II era, there have been plenty of countries that have tried this. It's usually called import substitution. And so what it means is you have high tariff walls, you block trade from outside, and you develop your manufacturing internally. China, that was China's mode of development before the late 1970s. Brazil did it. Who else? India did it. Lots of countries did it. The problem is you can bring back manufacturing, certainly. But what sort of manufacturing, right? I mean, it is non-competitive manufacturing. Prices are higher. The products are less good because they don't have the difficulty of dealing with international competition. And as for exports, forget it, because, you're dealing with products that aren't internationally competitive. So you can do it. It's usually developing countries. That's, the model for a lot of developing countries. You could argue the United States did it also, in the early days of the American Republic. But for a rich country, for the richest country in the world to turn to that model, I mean, that's never been done.
Well, I mean, it's not a surprise that China, US today are still the two largest economies in the world. But meanwhile, let's bring China into our conversation. Well, right after the announcement, after Donald Trump to place more tariffs upon China and also many other countries, news also came out of China that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit some of the countries in Southeast Asia, and for example, Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia in the mid-April. Now, the purpose for Xi's trip is to, and I quote, continue to pick China or to portray China as a reliable, steadfast partner, and to contrast this with the increasingly erratic nature of U.S. engagement with the region. Mr. Davis, from your perspective, how effective can this trip be? I mean, again, we're looking at China and U.S. are competing with each other, and why do you think the countries such as Vietnam and Cambodia or Malaysia will continue to see China as a reliable partner? How do we understand the word reliability today when we look at this uncertain world? We're looking at this a lot of uncertainty, especially from this political and also this economic standpoint.
Well, let's divide the impact of tariffs into two buckets. One is economic, one is geopolitical. On the economic front, tariffs from the U.S. will very much hurt China. It'll unquestionably hurt China more than the U.S. because China is more trade dependent than the U.S. is. Pretty simple that way. Geopolitically, it's an enormous opportunity. The U.S. is acting in an incredibly erratic fashion. It's alienating its allies and would-be allies. You have poor countries like Cambodia and Vietnam, which had tried to develop, through the usual contemporary way of doing it, export-led growth. The tariffs are significantly high on both those countries. It's going to really hurt those countries enormously. So it's really a great opportunity for China. However, let's remember the spin from China, a reliable partner. Yeah, I mean, they don't change the policies as much as the United States does, that's for sure. On the other hand, trading with China is not a picnic, right? I mean, China's to the degree that countries worry about China, it's because of exports from China that are seen as highly subsidized and difficult to compete with from countries that don't subsidize remotely as much. And that's true. It's not the only reason for China's success, but it's a big reason. All of a sudden, you have God, billions and billions of dollars of exports that would have gone to the U.S. that there isn't demand for in China. So what's going to happen? China's going to try to export it to other countries. So it's not as if China is going to be the savior remotely. So I mean, those exports will go somewhere. Other countries will feel the brunt of that. Says that, but on the other hand, yes, it's true. I mean, for Xi Jinping, I mean, it's a great opportunity for them to try to work out alliances with other countries in Southeast Asia, and also to try to repair damaged relations with Europe, which they've been trying for years. They have that export issue that I mentioned, but in addition, the Russia-Ukraine war. So, but again, geopolitically, it's a big opportunity.
Well, Mr. Davis, I want to, again, thank you for the explanation, but let's talk about the economic relationship between U.S. and China. I mean, during the campaign season, before Donald Trump was reelected, that he held two different attitudes. On one side, I believe that during numerous occasions that he mentioned he would be very glad to work with China, and he strongly believed that China, if the China played the card right, China could be a reliable partner or could be a good partner for the U.S. But on the other hand, Donald Trump also talked about that U.S. Should avoid being abused by China or the Chinese economy. But right now, he is the president. I mean, we're still looking at the competition between the two countries. What is the consistency within the Trump administration, according to your interpretation? Remember that no one, when I say no one, which means the international community, cannot stand that two countries, our two largest economies, are still competing with each other, and no one would like to see that. And of course, that we're seeing Xi Jinping, we're seeing Donald Trump, both of them, the two leaders, are what we called disruptors or unconventional leaders. So again, going back to the question to you, how do we understand the consistency under Donald Trump to China? And also, how do you think that China today is looking at Donald Trump and also should be willing to work with Donald Trump at this moment?
Well, don't look for consistency from Donald Trump. If you're looking for consistency, you'll be, disappointed every day. I think the way to think about Trump is he's ambivalent about China. And both of what you said is true. On the one hand, he thinks it's a menace, economically and maybe militarily. On the other hand, he wants to work with China. On the one hand, he has some, I don't know how much, but some reservations about Taiwan. On the other hand, he feels comfortable talking to autocrats like Xi Jinping, Putin, Erdogan of Turkey, and so on. I think the way to think about it is that Trump has hired many people who are very hawkish on China. That would make China the number one target. People like Marco Rubio, who you quoted, people like his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, Peter Navarro, a trade advisor, and others. Clearly, 100%, that they would make China the number one target. Trump is not like that. That is just not Trump. So you see, conflicting signals out of the United States, without a doubt. So I think one of the questions is, will Trump look for a way out of these tariffs, right? And one way out, because they will hurt the American economy, and they will hurt consumers, and they will hurt his standings in the poll. One way is, start negotiations with China. Basically, the same playbook that they did in the first administration. They can call it a different name, but essentially they concluded a phase one deal in the first administration. They'll try for a phase two deal. Again, they won't probably use the same name, but that's essentially what it is. I think no question that Trump would like to do that. Question is whether Xi Jinping wants to get involved in that. There had been my ex-colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Ling Wei, had written a story that the two were looking for a June meeting. I would imagine that these tariffs make it less likely that Xi Jinping would want to do that, but you can never rule it out. And that would be a way out of, so the U.S. imposed 34% tariffs, or is about to impose 34% tariffs on China. That's on top of 20% tariffs that the administration says are related to fentanyl. I mean, that's a lot of room for the U.S. to lower those tariffs significantly if they want to, or pause them, they might say. And a negotiation with China would be a way that would give face to Trump, who cares as much about face as anybody in China does, to pause them. So I mean, we don't know, but that would be certainly a way to de-escalate.
Mr. Davis, I'm very glad that you mentioned about there's a possibility that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are more likely to meet again, hopefully sometime this year. But there's another piece of reality that we all understand. There are still so many promising businesses from the US are still looking for opportunities in China. For example, the closest confidant of Donald Trump is Elon Musk. I mean, he's the owner of Tesla, and Tesla has a huge market in China. As a matter of fact, that based on the survey, that business for Tesla in China, it's growing exponentially, which means it's very promising. And also, for example, the company of Apple. I mean, again, we know that Chinese younger generations are still chasing after this famous brand. And even though we don't know whether the sales are going to be influenced by this tariff or not, and also we're looking at Starbucks. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. Another topic that you and I, we discussed briefly before taping the show, it's you actually had a new book out. And I want you to talk about this new book, and along with what I mentioned about Elon Musk and, the Apple company or Starbucks, I know that during the first Trump administration that we've heard the word decoupling and then transition into de-risking. But right now for your new book, if I'm not mistaken, it's something to do with a broken engagement. So can you help us with a better understanding whether Donald Trump is going to be influenced by the people around him, because since they all have business in China or they're still looking for opportunities in China? And second, is this still a broken engagement already, or is it too late to fix it? Go ahead.
Well, gosh, that's a lot of questions. So on the first book I did, Superpower Showdown, the subtitle was something about approaching a new Cold War, bringing us to the edge of a new Cold War. Without question, 100%. That we are now in a Cold War. It's not the same kind of Cold War as it was with the Soviet Union, but we're deeply into it. So that's number one. Thanks for mentioning the new book. It's called Broken Engagement. It's an ebook available on Kindle. And what it is that I have interviewed for a publication called The Wire China, dozens of people who have made U.S. policy toward China dating back to the first Bush administration. And one of the big questions that they wrestle with all the time is engagement. How much to engage with China? Is it possible to link the two countries together? Will it lead to the outcomes that, this is from the U.S. perspective, that the U.S. wanted? And you see it shift over time, but every administration wrestled with it. And also what you see, particularly in the early parts of the relationship, say during the Clinton years, you see an enormous influence by U.S. business on the setting of policy in China. I mean, there was one incident where the new Clinton administration was looking to press China on human rights and was threatening to cut off the lowest tariffs. China was then every year had to get reviewed by Congress whether to be entitled to have the lowest tariffs that the U.S. offers, and so the Secretary of State, who is then Warren Christopher, goes to China, tries to push China on human rights issues, talks to gosh, I'm forgetting his name, but it talks to one of the senior Chinese leaders, and the senior Chinese leader says, "Why should I listen to you? I had Goldman Sachs come in here the other day and say, that the human rights push really isn't that significant." So business had enormous impact. The Clinton administration backed off when it came to human rights. Under the first Trump administration, business had, excuse me, a lot of sway over Trump when it came to things like regulation, taxes, issues of that sort. When it came to trade in China, very little. Businesses were sort of messenger boys that would send messages from Chinese leadership, to Trump. But Trump basically stayed the course on tariffs. He would back off when the markets reacted enormously, but it wasn't because, some big donor, was able to get to him. Now, Elon Musk, you mentioned Elon Musk, he is different. He is the business advisor times 100, because in addition to everything else, he puts in hundreds of millions of dollars to the Republican Party. But still, I don't see that. And I'm sure if they talk about China, that Elon Musk would be a moderating influence. But I would not count on that at all to dissuade Trump to move ahead with tariffs. I mean, he clearly didn't, this time. And Musk produces a higher percentage of his cars in the U.S. than other manufacturers, but he depends on imports too. And they will raise the price of Teslas as well. So I know people in China look at Musk as a way to get to Trump, and it is a possible way, but I think they overplay the role that the business community has in influencing how Trump operates when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to the economic relationship with China.
Well, Mr. Davis, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Now, again, regarding the tariff or the trade war, not only made waves in China, but also across the continent. And now recently, the current Italian Prime Minister of Giorgia Meloni also weigh in regarding the tariffs. And this is what she said, and I quote, "Tariffs are not the end of the world." And Georgia, that she mentioned, or she stressed that EU not to do any retaliatory tariffs. Now, from your perspective, I know when we talk about the trade war or the tariff war, it's not just about U.S. and China, and also from the EU to China as well. So I want to hear your final thoughts when we hear the comments like the Italian Prime Minister say, hey, tariffs is not a big deal, and, there is still, it's workable, or, looking for negotiations. So the question to you is, how do you think that the word negotiation is going to work that in the midst of the trade war or in the midst of the tariffs? So in other words, we'll look at Donald Trump, we'll look at Xi Jinping, and we'll look at many other leaders. They are looking for ways to work with Trump. So, but from your perspective, do you think that Donald Trump is someone that willing to negotiate or can have a better deal? Because at the end of the day, no one would like to have more enemies rather than more friends. Your final thoughts.
Well, it's interesting about the Italian Prime Minister. I hadn't heard of that. A couple of thoughts on that. One, world leaders are trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with Trump. Is it to smack him in the face with retaliatory tariffs? Is it to back off and, hope that a more moderate approach would be the best way and get him into negotiations, which would wind up reducing the tariffs? I mean, as I had read that Italy was one of the countries in the European Union, excuse me, with the biggest trade surplus with the U.S., so would be hurt considerably by U.S. tariffs. On the third hand, I mean, she is, a member of the more far right leaning parties in Europe, and a lot of those are sort of nationalistic and probably like the idea of tariffs. When it comes to Italy. So there's a lot going on there. I presume she's trying to influence the EU, which the European Commission has a number of areas in which it has the primary responsibility. Trade is one of their responsibilities. So she's probably trying to influence them to take a moderate approach toward Trump, not be emotional about it, get into negotiations with the U.S. about ways to eliminate those tariffs. It might be the right way. That's clearly the way the Mexican president has tried to deal with Trump. The Israelis tried to deal with Trump that way. And honestly, we just don't know. I mean, just don't know. I mean, I think one of the many weaknesses of what the U.S. did is thinking that only the U.S. has a domestic political reaction, right? If you're Xi Jinping, you don't have to run for president, right? But you do have to continue to have the support within the leadership of the party, and the leadership of the party, is pretty nationalistic. So he has pressure on him, and he probably feels that way anyway. Respond in a nationalistic way. If you're the Europeans, you have a populace that is increasingly going to become more anti-American because of these tariffs. If you're in Canada, the same thing. So, Trump thinks he's like sort of the master of the world, but he's dealing with countries with very, very different political, pressures on them. And we don't know at this point, which technique would work best.
Well, again, Mr. Davis, I agree with you 100%. At this moment, we don't know how China is going to react, and also along with many other countries, and especially after the trip that the Chinese leader will visit some of the countries in Southeast Asia, and how they are going to react to Trump's tariffs demand, or all the details. But right now, at this moment, we only hope and pray that Donald Trump will understand that the decision should not be made by himself, and that he should definitely listen to more consultants or advisors around the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Mr. Bob Davis. Again, Mr. Davis has covered most every big economic story of the past 40 years, including the rise of China, the challenge from Japan, and the global financial crisis. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online to check out the two amazing books written by Mr. Davis. Again, Bob, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. And I promise you, this won't be the last time you and I will talk about the Chinese and the world economy. So thank you so much for doing this.